Here we go. Great, and we are live on an incredible Friday evening where we're going to be talking about all things resurrection related today. As we go into the Gospels today, we're going to be talking especially about the Gospel of Mark and the longer ending of that Gospel. And to delve into that, we have our very good friend, James Snap here. James, how have you been, brother?
I've been well, thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. And for people wondering, this is a vitally important topic, whether or not the longer ending of Mark would be the one that we would be able to say we've got a very good case that it is genuine. And as you know very well, brother, modern day kind of scholarship is unfortunately moved further and further away from considering it to be valid, considering it to be part of the original text of Scripture. And if we then fall in line and agree with that kind of modern day scholarship, then we're missing a very important account of the bodily resurrection of Christ. And doesn't it kind of open the door to a little bit to many more problems if we go down that road?
Yes, I think just as a matter of cause and effect, it has led to the questioning of faith in some cases. I don't think it automatically does so, but in some cases, people who say that in all four Gospels, the earliest one didn't have an account of the bodily resurrection of Christ. It just was a saying that he was resurrected somehow, but it was never confirmed to be a bodily resurrection. And so, for instance, I think James Tabor, who has written for Biblical Archaeology Review, he's kind of implied that was his experience.
Yeah, and I'm well aware of that. And for people, I know people may be wondering. Let's look at that briefly, because even though you know very well what the actual text is, a lot of people still really wonder. A lot of people are wondering, okay, where is the longer ending? So where would the longer ending begin? It would begin in verse 9, wouldn't it?
Mark 16, verse 9, yes.
Okay, so let me go ahead and before we even begin, I completely forgot. Good thing we're just having casual conversation. Can somebody pray for us? Maybe Gloria, would you be able to pray for us? It would be a blessing if you could.
Yes, let me get my thing real quick.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Gloria.
Yeah, of course. Hold on one second. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, we thank you and we give you glory for sharing your word with us today. We thank you for William and for our guest. He will share all his information and he will reveal your heart to us, and we will reveal our heart to him. We thank you, Lord, for this journey we are on with William and our guest. Thank you, Lord, for always reminding us we can always trust in you. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much for that, Gloria. And with that being said, before the brother James begins, I'm going to go ahead and read what we're talking about today, so people can recognize that we're indeed talking about the Gospel of Mark. And you frequently hear it brought up. For anybody that has heard any debates I've had, and I've debated a number of atheists, they're going to right away tell you, well, we don't have a bodily resurrection account in Mark. And then they're going to say Mark is the oldest gospel. So you guys have a big problem, they'll tell us. So what we're looking at in Mark, we literally read, now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him, as they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. After that, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they walked and went into the country. And they went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, he appeared to the 11 as they sat at the table. He rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will follow those who believe. In my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover." So then, after the Lord had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and confirming the word through the accompanying signs. Amen. So what we have here, as you recognize, you have the little footnote right here. We're pretty much, in essence, told that, you know what, it's an addition. It isn't part of the original text. With that being said, brother, what are your thoughts on this? Speak. The floor is yours.
Well, in the New King James Version that you were reading, I think the footnote is relatively balanced. I don't think it necessarily would point toward omission, but it does point out that in the Nestle Allen text, the UBS text, they're bracketed, which they are. And they're lacking in Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, although nearly all other manuscripts of Mark contain them. And that's certainly true. But if you look in the NIV, just recently, Mark Strauss, who is, I believe, rather influential in how Zondervan is editing the NIV. If you look in the NIV, there is the format is quite different than what you see in the New King James. There's just a straight line across the page. The heading note then is, instead of having it footnoted, the heading note is actually inserted in the text and bracketed in the text. So there is a heading note that says the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 through 20, and then verses 9 through 20 appears, but it's all in italics from beginning of verse 9 to the end of verse 20. So I think there's no doubt when you consider that they're not going into detail. There's no mention of patristic evidence. They're just giving enough evidence to point the reader toward accepting the view that Mark 16:9-20 is not to be regarded as authentic or authoritative. So that's where I think the NIV is headed, unfortunately. And when you look at the number of manuscripts, you often will see in footnotes references to some manuscripts say this and others say that, but the earliest manuscripts don't have verses 9 to 20, and that's considered the key evidence, as if everything depends upon these two manuscripts, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Now, that theory that the exaltation of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus is nothing new, that was brought into play by Westcott and Hort way back in 1881. But if we can just pause a second and get an idea of what are we looking at when it says the earliest manuscripts have this reading and the other manuscripts have this reading. What is the others that have Mark 16:9-20? If we could see that initial slide that I have there.
Right there.
Yes. The manuscripts that support Mark 16:9-20. These are Uncial manuscripts at the top. So, but the overwhelming majority of Uncial manuscripts have it. Not Vaticanus and not Sinaiticus from the 300s. We'll get to the details about them in a minute here. But nobody should have footnotes like what we see in the message, or what occurred in some other New Testaments in English. Some of the footnotes just need to be redone. But Codex Alexandrinus includes Mark 16:9-20. Codex C includes Mark 16:9-20. Codex D, which is also known as Codex Beza, it was available in the 1500s. And all the rest of these support the inclusion of Mark 16:9-20. So it's not as if it appears in just a small number of manuscripts. So the person can say, well, some say this and some say that. But the second sum includes all these magistral manuscripts written in uncial lettering, but also all these minuscules, which all have their own ancestry. There are very, very few of these can be connected in a mother and daughter kind of relationship. But so each one of these would represent an echo of earlier manuscripts that came before it. But that's not all of them. There's also a few more. Can we see the next slide? We have a considerable number of additional manuscripts besides the ones we just saw. And this is not all. There's also a considerable number of other Greek manuscripts that have been handed down through the church. And here's more of them.
Let me ask you, brother, for people that may be looking and may not quite understand, what do the numbers before us mean? Are those numbers of manuscripts of excuse me?
Each one of these numbers represents a separate Greek manuscript of the Gospel of Mark.
Wow. And these would include the longer ending of Mark, is that correct?
These include verses 9 through 20. Yes.
Incredible. So from what I'm looking at and from what I'm gathering, there are quite the number of witnesses that have the longer ending of Mark. So what?
There's more than this. There's some more.
Now, and when
the next slide, please.
Okay, sure. And before we go to that, let me ask one quick question. When it comes to Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, right? Well, why exactly were those elevated, I guess, to the pantheon of being the ultimate when it comes to documentation? Why did that originate? Where did that come from? Well, we heard where it came from, but was there an agenda behind that?
Well, early on in the 1800s, Vaticanus was not really discovered, because it was known to be, even from the 1500s, it was known to be in the Vatican Library, but it was given much more air, the ability to study its readings, and people began to appreciate it as a representative of a different line of transmission. There was most of these manuscripts that you see listed are from the Byzantine text line. If you could think of them as branches of a tree, and all of these that you see, or most of them that you see, represent the Byzantine transmission line. When Vaticanus was made widely known, it was recognized as being a representative of the Alexandrian text, and that was generally regarded as a separate text line. And that's why it was considered especially important, because it was like finding a very good representative of this other transmission line. But by the way, these are not the only manuscript. There's still some more. We could see the just continue. Yes.
Wow, look at that.
So in all, last time I counted, I'm sure that this is a little short than what it really is, but at least 1,643 manuscripts support the inclusion of Mark 16, 9 through 20. And because Mark 16, 9 through 20 was one of the Hiothena series of readings in the lectionary, you could also look into lectionaries, which I haven't listed here, but you could increase the number by hundreds more by consulting the lectionaries, which were not listed in a continuous text, but you have the reading attested as being used in the church as an accepted authoritative reading. And that would be in hundreds more. About 40% of our manuscripts are lectionaries. But those aren't included here. These are just the continuous text Greek manuscripts, mostly.
Which, from what I gather and from what I've noted, brother, is that you rarely don't hear that evidence brought up, at least when dialoguing with individuals. So one example would be a debate I recently had against atheist John Loftus, who is good friends with people in the field of academia. And one of the main talking points he brought up in his opening statement, and one that you know very well, is that the Gospel of Mark, they'll argue, well, you know what, the very first Gospel doesn't even have a resurrection account. They'll begin to quote all sorts of scholars, but you don't hear them bring up the massive amount of manuscript evidence favoring it, do you?
No, you do not. There's a reason for that. One of the people who is responsible for compiling the base text of the NIV and the ESV and most modern translations was Kurt Allen, and Kurt Allen said very openly in this book, The Text of the New Testament, he very openly said that we consider the Byzantine text. If a manuscript has a Byzantine text, we consider it irrelevant for the purposes of textual criticism. So they pretty much, not that everybody did, but definitely what he expresses was that he more or less indulges in the model of transmission of that Westcott and Hort presented way back in 1181. So that would give the Sinaiticus and Vaticanus a presumption of superiority, even without considering the papyri evidence. Of course, Hort didn't have any papyri to consider back in 1881. Now that we do, we generally consider his model of transmission to be oversimplified, but you hardly would ever realize that from the compilation being made. It is made with the premise of Westcott and Hort rejecting everything unique in the Byzantine text. But some English Bibles still even get very basic things wrong. If we can look at the slide that mentions some of what their statements are. Some Bible footnotes about Mark 16:9-20 don't get it right. For instance, in the Message, Crossway or whoever's printing the Message these days should go back and fix the footnote, because the footnote, anybody can find Codex A online and see very easily. Codex A is no lightweight, and Codex A has Mark 16:9-20. So just like that, the statement's wrong. Mark 16:9-20, the Message says, is contained only in later manuscripts. The Jerusalem Bible says that many manuscripts omit verses 9-20. The English Standard Version in 2010 described the evidence this way. It said some manuscripts end the book at 16:8. Others include verses 9-20 immediately after verse 8. A few manuscripts insert additional material after verse 14. One Latin manuscript adds after verse 8 the following: but they reported briefly to Peter and to those with him all they had been told, and after this Jesus himself sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. And that's what's known as the shorter ending. Technically, the ending at verse 8 is also short, but because this has been come to be known as the shorter ending, that's just kind of called the abrupt ending, or the ending at verse 8. But what you see here in italics is called the shorter ending, and we'll take a close look at that hopefully soon. Then it says other manuscripts include the same wording after verse 8, then continue with verses 9-20. That note is not correct, so in 2013 the note was slightly changed, and now it says, instead of a few manuscripts, because in real life there's only one manuscript that has additional material after verse 8. So the statement in 2010 that said a few manuscripts, that was erroneous. Jerome refers to some manuscripts that have this. In fact, Jerome, in his writing against the Pelagians, he says that he had seen this reading after Mark 16:14, and he had seen it especially in Greek codices. But those manuscripts have not survived. The only manuscript that has this feature that we have is Codex W. So the answer is not a few, not at least one. The answer is one. It's just Codex W, folks. So I don't know why they said at least one when everybody should know perfectly well it's just one. But that's the way the evidence has changed. But you can see how a light touch has been placed on this in terms of the research that went into the ESV. They were able to say a few manuscripts have the Philologion, which really is in only one manuscript.
Really incredible there, because as you point out there, the wording really would lead you to believe that there is more evidence for that. But it seems to me that it is worded in a particular way that you can make the argument that is a bit misleading.
You probably could. In the CSB, the footnote is different. It says other manuscripts. Now there's a heading note in the text between verse 8 and verse 9 that says some of the earliest manuscripts conclude with 16:8. Then the footnote says other manuscripts include verses 9-20. Now we saw what the other was, that 1,600 odd manuscripts. Other manuscripts include verses 9-20 as a longer ending. The following shorter ending is found in some manuscripts between verse 8 and verse 9, and then one manuscript after verse 8 each of which omits verses 9 through 20. And then it gives the text of the shorter ending that we looked at before, that you can see right here in front of you.
Yeah.
But the CSB's footnote doesn't make any sense, because it says, the following shorter ending is found in some manuscripts between verse 8 and verse 9, and then one manuscript after verse 8. Now, that one manuscript that has it after verse 8, or at least after most of verse 8, is the old Latin Codex Vaticanus. So first, we're talking about a Latin versional copy instead of the Greek manuscripts. But also, there in parentheses, it says, each of which omits verses 9 through 20. No CSB footnote writer, that is incorrect. All of the Greek copies that have the shorter ending in it, in them, also included verses 9 through 20 when they were in the pristine form. Now, some of them are very small fragments and they're damaged, but at least verse 9 is there. So that footnote in the CSB that says each of which omits verses 9 through 20 is simply incorrect. So there again, you can see how much work has gone into looking into verses 9 through 20.
What a really good point that you're making there. Then, so you really, when it comes to Greek manuscripts, we have quite the pedigree when it comes to the heritage of the history, that we can come to the conclusion that perhaps, very likely, with a very good, strong certainty, this belongs in the text.
Yeah, but before we go into some more details about that, let's look in the International Inductive Study Bible, which is New American Standard. Its footnote says, a few later manuscripts and versions contain this paragraph, which is a reference to the shorter ending. Usually after verse 8, a few have it at the end of the chapter. Again, this statement is erroneous. The UBS compilation was also erroneous. That's probably because of that error that this error was produced, because nobody double checked the data. But the manuscripts that have the shorter ending have it between verse 8 and verse 9. It never appears at the end of the chapter. So there again, another mistake. So don't think that just because a footnote writer has said something that an adequate amount of information is being given to the reader, it's not only inadequate, it's not even correct. But you can see from the Message, from the Jerusalem Bible, from the CSB's error, from the old New American Standard. Now, there's so many editions of the New American Standard, you might find one that doesn't have that footnote these days. Probably will. But you can see that there's been confusion and error in the English Bibles, in the footnotes, until very recently, and even including some to this day. But you'll realize that I've showed you now how many Greek manuscripts include Mark 16:9-20. But let's see the flip side. Let's see all the manuscripts. I mean, it must be a huge amount, right? That have the ending at 16:8. Can we see the slide that has all that information, all that long list? Yeah, this is all three. That's it. You're seeing now all the Greek manuscripts in which the text of the Gospel of Mark ends at 16:8. That's it. This one on your left is a Gregory Allen 304, which is a medieval commentary manuscript. It's not a continuous text manuscript of Mark, but it has some text from Mark, then commentary, text from Mark, commentary, and so forth. And its last page, you can see some damage on it, but here's where its text of Mark 16:8 stops. Then there's some more commentary, and then it just ends. There's nothing to say, and here ends the Gospel of Mark. What we have here is a little note that's basically to the gist of, as a traveler is relieved to see his home, so is a scribe relieved when he sees the end of the book. But there's usually something else, and so 304 is just weird. If it didn't have this feature, nobody would really notice it. But here's are the two biggies, the ones that Westcott Hort exalted as the best representatives of the Alexandrian text. And here is Codex Vaticanus. and here is Codex Sinaiticus. And there are interesting things about both of these manuscripts. When they say some Greek copies are the best copies, are the most reliable copies, these are the two they're talking about. They're not talking about, for their purposes at this point in the text, they're not talking about Alexandrinus, they're certainly not talking about Beza, they're certainly not talking about Codex W. They're talking about these two manuscripts because that's all the early manuscripts there are that we have that end Mark at 16:8. I gotta see. That's me.
No problem, brother. But bless you. Look, for the audience to really kind of get an idea of what you're pointing out, because I've got to tell you, brother, it is incredible whenever I look at the evidence and whenever you present the kind of evidence like this. So really, what we're kind of led to believe is that there is a monumental amount of evidence that would indicate that the longer ending of Mark, which has the bodily resurrection account, that apparently we're led to believe that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that doesn't belong there and that there are a ton of manuscripts that would lack it. But indeed, in terms of early testimony, this is it. Am I correct?
Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, as far as early manuscripts go, these are the two, as far as early Greek manuscripts go, these are the only two early Greek manuscripts that end the text of Mark at Mark 16:8.
Wow.
Now, in versions, there's also the Sinaitic Syriac, there's one Sahidic manuscript, which is housed in Barcelona, and there's also Old Latin Babiensis, which is an important early Old Latin manuscript. But that's it, as far as the early evidence that has survived to this day go. But there's something interesting about Codex Vaticanus. You'll notice that here is its text of Mark, and then we have a blank space at the end of the second column, and that's not too unusual. But the blank column that follows, a blank column, is very unusual in Codex Vaticanus. Now, there are some incidental, and by some I mean three. There are three incidental blank spaces in the Old Testament portion, but those three blank spaces are clearly elicited by production factors in the production of the manuscript. Before the book of Psalms, the text shifts from what is usually a 3 columns per page to in the Psalms, it's 2 columns per page. So naturally, when the ruling itself changes, you have a blank space before the change. Also, where one scribe's work meets another scribe's work, you have a space between them. It's simply because one scribe had no way to exactly line up his work with the end of the folio. And then at the end of Daniel, which is where the Old Testament ends in Codex Vaticanus, you have, of course, leftover space on the page before you get to the New Testament. All those are easily discernible, and they have nothing to do with as if the scribes were planning to leave those blank spaces. Those were blanks that just happened. But here in Codex Vaticanus, which is the only place in the whole New Testament where you have an entire blank column, here we have a full blank column. Why is the blank column there? Right at this point where there is a known textual variant. Well, I did some looking into that, and you can see on the next page, this is an example of what's called memorial space. If you can turn to the next slide, please.
Okay, the next one, absolutely. There you go. You have it. That is incredible. Wow, that is really, really up close. Wow.
What you have here is on the left side is the page as you can find it, say, the Vatican Library. But out of curiosity, I was wondering how close does that blank space, the memorial space, correspond to the text of Mark 16:9-20. So I digitally cut and pasted from the copy stone handwriting letters that would be what we find in Mark 16:9-20. It would not fit exactly. You would need a few more lines. But using the scribe's own lettering, by just slightly compressing the letters, you could fit Mark 16:9-20 into that blank space. You even would have room at the end there for the closing title. So
wow.
Now memorial space didn't have to be exact. For instance, in Codex L, where the space for the story of the woman caught in adultery, and in the Codex Delta, where the space for the woman caught in adultery, the scribes weren't really trying to fit the right dimensions of the space, so a person wanting to put it in could put it in. But if a person did want to put it in into Codex Vaticanus, they would have been able to. So I think there's little doubt that this copyist who made Codex Vaticanus, even though he did not have Mark 69-20 in his master copy, he had clearly seen it somewhere else and made this memorial space for the purposes of conveying to the reader there was more here in another source.
Now, brother, I wonder what in your best estimation, why would his master copy have maybe not had that?
Well, in my book, I get into the idea of what would happen in the Alexandrian text stream. Not all scribes were created equal. Some would simply, reproduce the text set before them and not worry about it. Some would be a little bit pickier. And in my book, I theorized that the last 12 verses of Mark were considered to be not something that had the approval of Peter. And so they were excised. Now, it wouldn't have to be just a one-step process, but in 1 or 2 steps, they were considered to be secondary on some level. So in the Alexandrian text stream, not everywhere else. I mean, the Gospel of Mark went far wide, but in the Alexandrian text stream, it shows up in Egypt without verses 9-20. Then after it's there in Egypt for a while, people just can't stand ending the book at verse 8. And so somebody writes the shorter ending to just kind of round off the narrative. And from that point, things go from there. Later on, when verses 9-20 arrive, it's included in, for instance, Codex 044 and the other witnesses that have the shorter ending and followed by the longer ending. But in the Alexandrian text stream, that's where we see the shorter ending appear. And that's where we see that then, after it's been there a while, that's where we see the double ending, which is just another way of saying we see the shorter ending followed by verses 9-20. So there's the example of Codex Sinaiticus, and I'll maybe revisit this subject of why would a scribe consider something secondary later on. But let's look at the second witness that we have, Codex Sinaiticus, because both of these two manuscripts that are being depended on, without being said, they're the only two. Instead, they're described in vague terms. So it's not really brought into focus. I don't think that's an accident that it's not brought into focus, but that's what we see in many of the English versions in the footnotes. But let's look now at Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Sinaiticus. In Codex Sinaiticus, the 4 pages that one of them is the page on which Mark ends. These 4 pages are not they're not written by the same scribe who made the pages that come before and after them. Although there's no notice to this effect in the textual apparatus of Nestle-Aland, these are replacement pages by a different scribe. So the main scribe goes along writing Mark 13, 14, 15. But here, on this folio, he made some kind of bad mistake. So when those pages got to the proofreader said, or the diothotes, the proofreader, he said, no, this won't do. We're going to have to redo these 4 pages. You made a terrible mistake. Now, you might logically think that, it's got to have something to do with the ending of Mark, right? Not necessarily, because even though we don't have videotape, we can deduce by the format of the new pages that the mistake was somewhere, or the main mistake, he didn't have to make just one, but the main mistake was in the Gospel of Luke. Because when we see how he's writing along, the scribes, the diothotes' main challenge was make the text of these replacement pages fit in with the next page made by the main scribe. So his big challenge is in Luke. So after he's written page after page of Luke, not page after page, but column after column of Luke, that's when he then goes back to the beginning of Mark, and he can relax there and say, well, I can take it easy at this point. The hard work is done. The hard work was in Luke, where can we maybe enlarge that just a little?
Yeah, definitely. Let me.
Because we see after he's ended Mark, there in the second row, or the second, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. In column 10, he ends Mark. In column 11, he begins Luke. But look at the difference in how he's writing the letters very compactly. His first line in Mark is 635 letters per column. His second column is 650. But in Luke, it's 681, then 670. Then on that last page, there in the lower right-hand corner, 702 letters, 687 letters, 725 letters, and 679 letters.
Wow.
Obviously here the copyist is contracting his letters because the main scribe left something out that he's got to put in, but he's only got the same amount of space to do it. So that's why those columns are so compressed. The letters are kind of squished together. Whereas if you look at the first three columns in beginning in Mark 1454, he's writing at a pretty relaxed pace. But the fourth column is different. Now, I suspect, again, I don't have videotape, so this is a hypothesis here. But I suspect that because he had been writing in compacted letters for Luke, he just kind of drifted into compacted letters where he didn't need to use compacted letters in that fourth column in Mark. Then he realized what he was doing, came to his senses, and went back to writing, and said, "Well, I'm going to need to stretch things out because I've just finished accidentally compressing the letters." And so we see beginning of Mark 15:17, he goes back to not just to his normal rate that we see in Mark 14, but he even stretches his letters out. So he's trying to he knows that he's already written Luke, and he's got to make this text in Mark go to column 10. So now he's at 592 letters, 604 letters, 605 letters. But as he writes Mark 16:1, the Diathotes, the proofreader, he makes a mistake. He leaves out most of Mark chapter 16, verse 1. He just skips ahead erroneously. And so when he gets to column 9, he realizes, no, I've made a mistake. I have a choice. I can either start the whole thing over after all that work, or I can make the rest of this text of Mark 16 to stretch out. And so he stretches out his lettering very drastically. We see there in column 9, there are only 552 letters. Now, normally, a copyist could write both of those columns, column 9 and column 10, 552 plus 39. That's less than 600. That's less than his normal rate per column. So he could easily have just gone down that column and finished the text of Mark in column 9, but he didn't. Instead, he stretched out his letters. At one point, he even uncontracts the name of Jesus, which most copies would not do. The name of Jesus was considered a sacred name, and it was to be contracted. But he stretched out his letters in order to collect 37 letters to put up there at the top of the 10th column. So not only do we see that these are replacement pages, but we also see that it was on the mind of the scribe to not leave a blank column, to not give any reader the chance of seeing a blank column after Mark 16:8. Also, when you look up close, you can't see very well in the image here, but you can go to the website and zoom in on it, codexsinaiticus.org. And if you zoom in on that closing line after Mark 16:8, you'll see that it's uniquely emphatic. It's as if it's almost like the Diathotes wanted there to be a fence at that point to say, I know what you're thinking, but I don't want that added in here. And then you have the closing title of the Gospel of Mark. So not only is there evidence in Vaticanus of the scribe's awareness of this textual issue, but also we see here that the copyist wanted to avoid leaving a blank column, which implies that he was aware of the textual issue.
That really is incredible then. So he would have been aware of that issue then. So that is another thing that you don't hear. You don't hear that. It really isn't told to you from modern day people working in the field of academia, people working in textual criticism. But for the audience to know, you do have this information on your book that you do offer on your webpage, don't you?
Yes, yes. The count is included in a special section in my book.
And your book is very affordable. I know that. So people, they definitely should check that out.
Yes, you can get it as a Kindle book for 99 cents. And if you can't afford a Kindle book, don't have a Kindle, you can also download it from academia. On one of my slides here, I have the links to that.
Very good.
That's Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and that's the two manuscripts they're talking about when they say the earliest manuscripts don't have Mark 16:9 to 20, or the oldest and most reliable manuscripts don't have Mark 16:9 to 20. And these are the earliest manuscripts, but it's certainly not the earliest evidence. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. There's some commentators make a claim that about notes that accompany Mark 16:9 to 20 in a small cluster of manuscripts, and they also make claims. I think Dan Wallace is especially guilty of this, of making claims about asterisks and oboli. And so, if we could, let's take a closer look at the claim about asterisks and oboli that's been spread far and wide. This is from Bruce Metzger's textual commentary on the Greek New Testament. He said, "Not a few manuscripts which contain the passage have scribal notes, stating that older Greek copies lack it, and in other witnesses, and that's important, in other witnesses, the passage is marked with asterisk or oboli, the conventional signs used by copyists to indicate a spurious addition to a document." Now, there's this. I think if you wanted to, you could probably document what is called a commentator's yeast. It's the tendency of commentators to take a comment by a respected source that they've read and add some yeast to it to stretch it out a little bit, to rephrase it, make it a little bit more impressive than the other writer made it sound. For instance, Eugene Nida, referring to Ethiopic manuscripts, he read somewhere back in the 60s the claim that some Ethiopic copies end at Mark 16:8. Well, when Nida rephrased that, it's importing Ethiopic copies. Now, as it turns out, it wasn't any Ethiopic copies at all. There was just a miscitation that Metzger later on retracted. But that's one example of how how commentators tend to stretch things out from the simpler statement that they've read. Now, this claim about asterisks and oboli has gone to many other commentators. For instance, N.T. Wright has made the same claim, and Craig Evans has made the same claim, and it's being distributed by commentators. But do they ever take the time to double check the claim? I don't think they have. Even Dan Wallace, in his chapter in Perspectives on the Ending of Mark, repeated this claim, even listed the manuscripts, but I don't think he ever checked them, because if he had, he would see those manuscripts don't have the feature that he is suggesting or stating that they have. I've gone over these manuscripts one by one at my blog, thetextofthegospels.com, and you can see those marks that in all the copies that have scribal notes. They do not have they might have an asterisk beside the note, or that refers to the note, but those marks are simply there the same way we have footnote numbers for footnotes. A footnote doesn't, in and of itself per se, does not mean we want to imply that this passage is spurious. The footnote number simply refers to a footnote because it's linking to the footnote. That's all these marks do. And you can tell that when a passage refers to the note, oftentimes it's to a note from what was called the Catena Marcum, and in the Catena Marcum, there's a note very much in favor of Mark 16:9 to 20, not against it. So let's look at what most people are thinking of when they see manuscripts with notes. But I just want to emphasize there are no non-annotated manuscripts that have text critically significant asterisks or oboli. And that point is cleared up. Let's take a closer look at the manuscripts that do have notes of some sort.
Brother, I have to tell you that is a very serious claim, and I wonder if you have you ever brought that up to Dan Wallace or to anyone else, and have they even bothered to give you a response?
I've tried. I very, very much tried, especially in the case of Craig Evans.
Yeah.
But here is what's called the note about Mark 16:9-20, and the note is very simple. The note is not the ancient copies don't have it. The note is not a lot of copies don't have it. The note goes like this. There's basically two forms of the note. One is more ancient than the other, but they're clearly both connected. In other words, they're not just random copies that just happen to pop up way over here and way over there, and they just happen to say something similar. These are connected. They have a common line of descent. In manuscript 1, 205, 2886, 209, and 1582, the note says, in some of the copies, the evangelist's work is finished here, and so do Eusebius Pamphilius' canons. But in many, this also appears. Now, oftentimes the commentators will convey the gist of this right up to that last sentence. But that last sentence seems to get dropped off somehow. The scribe who made this note wrote, in many copies, this also appears. So in some copies, the evangelist's work is finished here. So do Eusebius, by the way, Eusebius Pamphili, that's a reference to Eusebius of Caesarea. His mentor was Pamphilus, and so he called himself by that name. But that's the guy who's being referred to. The canons are the cross-reference system for the Gospels that he made. Now, during the Middle Ages, gradually the canons were expanded, and so you might get to a point where Eusebius Pamphilius canons are there. They do include the passages. For instance, you can see if you take a close look at 1582, you can see the numbers in the left side. Those refer to the canon numbers, the section numbers, and they are there. So to a person who's using copies of Mark where the Eusebian canons are in a longer form, it wouldn't do to have a note that says Eusebius's canons in here. And so you have other manuscripts like 15, 22, 1110, 1192, and 1210 that just say the shorter form, just that first part. It says, in some of the copies, the gospel is completed here, but in many, this also appears. And you also have a group, 20, 215, and 300, that say, but in the ancient ones, it is all there. Now, that's kind of contrary to the impression that a person would get if they were just reading Bruce Metzger's textual commentary, because what he would say is that there was some that just say that some older manuscripts don't have the passage. Well, obviously, in terms of any manuscript that's written down that's being referenced in a note is older than the note, but the note also says in many this also appears. So it's not exactly a well-balanced or evenly presented presentation of the evidence. So, but that's the note that's being referred to. Now also, it should be emphasized that this note is just referring to basically two clusters of manuscripts. It's manuscripts in family one, and it's manuscripts that have what's called the Jerusalem colophon. That's what it's not just a randomly occurring note. It occurs specifically in this group of connected manuscripts. It's connected. The note appears in these particular manuscripts because it's part of that transmission line.
Now, for people that may be wondering, who exactly is Eusebius? Who is that? In case people are wondering, is that an important figure? Is that a prominent patristic figure? Exactly who is that?
Eusebius of Caesarea was a very important figure in the early 300s. He was kind of a court secretary in a sense, but also he's probably best known for writing the church history, using various sources that were kept there at the library at Caesarea. He worked out a selective history of the church, and he also was in charge of a scriptorium. And he himself reports that now we just have his word to go on, but I think he's trustworthy to an extent. Eusebius reported that Emperor Constantine said, Eusebius, my city, my new city, Constantinople, is growing. The churches are growing. They need more copies of the God's word. So I commission you with the royal treasury at your disposal to make 50 copies of God's word for these churches. And that's online. You can go into and see the exact, more exact translation of that command from the emperor. And Eusebius says, I did so, and I sent my copies to where they were supposed to go in 3s and 4s. Now, what 3 or 4 is supposed to mean? That doesn't mean 3 columns per page, 4 columns per page. I think that means he sent them in 3 or 4 at a time, because the clock was ticking. He wanted to get it done quickly. And some people think that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus might have been among those 50 copies. I don't think so, though, because various textual reasons. For instance, in Matthew 27:49, both Vaticanus and Sinaiticus have an unusual reading. It's an erroneous reading in Vaticanus and in Sinaiticus that says in Matthew that Jesus was pierced with a spear before he died. And Westcott and Hort especially, seemed to indicate that he favored the inclusion of that passage. Now, of course, it was rejected in the RV, and it's rejected in the ESV and so forth. There's not even a footnote about it, even though these are the same 2 manuscripts that you see are being relied on so much at the ending of Mark. But those 2 manuscripts have this reading, but in the Eusebian canons, there's no evidence that Eusebius was aware of that reading, because the idea is that he would have put it in his 10th canon, which was a part of the list that was reserved for unique readings, or part of the list that was reserved for readings between just 2 of the Gospels, and it's nowhere in Eusebius's canons. So that's one point against the Eusebian canons being there. Also, Codex Vaticanus doesn't even have the Eusebian canons in it. It has a very different way of dividing the chapters. But Codex Sinaiticus probably was made at Caesarea, I think, in the generation right after Eusebius. That's who Eusebius was. That's what the Eusebian canons are. In some copies, the copyist, now usually the copyist's job was just to not really be an artist. He was just there to copy the text. But also in the scriptorium, sometimes there would be an artist, and they would sometimes go crazy with the amount of embellishment and elaboration and detail they would put in the decorations for the cross-reference system for the Gospels.
And you bring up a really good point there, that for people that don't know, I'm glad that you brought it up, that we're dealing with a prominent early church figure, one who is very well known, a very important focal figure in the early churches. So that was a great point there, brother. I greatly appreciate that. For people that maybe don't know and are learning as they go along, this is very, very important information. This is really, really fantastic. So what do you want me to go ahead and go to the next slide?
Yes, go ahead. Oh, that's the same one again. Yeah.
There we go.
Now, in Egypt, where the text of Mark went initially with just up to verse 8, there came along the short ending. Somebody in Egypt said, "We can't just end it there. It just doesn't end. That's not ending. That's stopping." And so somebody made the short ending, and we've already read the short ending in some English footnotes. But the total number of Greek manuscripts of Mark with the shorter ending is 6. No, out of 1,600 odd, no, we got it in 6. And so when you put the footnotes in English translations, when you bring them into detail, bring them into focus, you see Sinaiticus and Vaticanus with indications built into the manuscripts that the scribes of those manuscripts were aware of a textual problem involving the end of Mark. But also there was the short ending, which, when you look at the short ending, it's distinctly Egyptian. That's where it began. Now later on, it trickled on down to versions like the Ethiopic version and the Baharic version, some of the Harklian Syriac, which was made using manuscripts in Egypt at the end time. But if you compare the way the text is formatted on the page, and here we have a Codex Regius. One of the 6 is Codex L. But when you compare the format of Codex L to the very similar Greek Sahidic lectionary 1602, now by Sahidic we basically mean Egyptian, and compare the two, even the notes are even lining up along the page. So there's no doubt that the connection is to that particular locale in Egypt. While Mark 16:9-20 was being spread, uniformly, pretty much everywhere else, it was in Egypt that this short ending arose, and it was because of that the whole because of that initial ending at verse 8 that elicited the production of the shorter ending. But then when verses 9-20 were somebody in Egypt realized, hey, there's more to this that everybody else is using, then verses 9-20 were included. We even have copies of Egyptian lectionaries that have verses 9-20 in their lectionary. Sometimes the Philologion is called a different ending. I think in Daniel Wallace's NET, it is described as if it's a different ending. And I've seen a video online where the person who's apparently read this from Daniel Wallace has unfortunately claimed in the video that, oh yeah, after verse 14 we have this Philologion, and we never do get to the part about the snakes and the poisons, which of course all you have to do to prove that is wrong is to just look at the manuscript in Codex W. And by the way, Jerome, like I mentioned before, was aware of this reading, and he said that he found it especially in Greek codices. I'll keep that in mind. Hopefully we'll revisit Jerome and Eusebius in a little bit.
Yeah.
But in Codex W, here, if you look at these pages, Mark 16:9 is on the page following verse 8. Then you have the Philologion here on this middle page. Then you have verse 16, and it goes all the way through the rest of the text, verse 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And that's it. And then you have this little, very, very interesting closing book title with a little extra note. But that's all there is to the Philologion. It's not a different ending. But by its nature, it could not stand as a different ending. It's simply an interpolation. So sometimes it's put in there to say, oh, but we have this other ending too, but it's not really a different ending. It's verses 9-20 with material between verses 14 and 15. So the idea of there being this replication, or as John MacArthur, I think, in a sermon that he gave, said that endings were piling up, and James White speaks about there were 5 endings to Mark, trying to give the impression that endings were just popping up over here and popping up over there, and there was one popping up over there. No, in the real world, the shorter ending popped up. That was the only alternative ending to pop up, and that was kept pretty closely in the one specific locale in Egypt. And we can see its connection to Egypt. We look at Codex Regius compared to Greek Sahidic Lectionary 1602, and we can also see in another manuscript, 083, the way when it presents the verses 9-20, it doesn't just present verses 9-20. It kind of rewinds into verse 8 and begins representing the text of verse 8, and we see that also being done in this other witness. So that connects those witnesses to Egypt. It's a localized reading. So that's the short reading. Any
idea how it came about to originate in Egypt? Any idea how that came? Do you have an opinion as to how that came about?
Yes. I think that when people first saw the Gospel of Mark, if you look into the internal evidence, you can see pretty clearly when you look at verse 8, and then you make that transition over to verse 9, Mary Magdalene is reintroduced, and also the time of day is mentioned again, and her companions, which were there before, all of a sudden they're not mentioned. It's like it's just Mary Magdalene now. What I think happened, and this might cross over a bit into a higher criticism, but when Mark is writing the Gospel of Mark, before he's writing the Gospel of Mark, he's continually making records of the recollections of Peter. And if you look at writers like Papias, we see this is the way that the Gospel of Mark is said to have come about in early traditions. That Peter was the technical term is amanuensis. The non-technical term is gopher. He would go for this and go for that. But he was also the secretary who would write things down. The idea is we all know that Peter's not going to live forever. Can we have a record of what he's got of what he said about Jesus? And the Christians in Rome, they were asking Mark, hey, could you make us a record of what Peter has been telling us all this time about Jesus? And so by the mid-60s, Mark already has a collection of Petrine remembrances about Jesus. But a little later on, people saying, can you make us something definitive? And that's when he sits down to write what we know as the Gospel of Mark. But during the mid 600s, things got crazy in Rome. Things were calamitous. There were persecutions. Christians were being burned in palace courtyards and so forth. At this time, my theory is that when we see Mark 16:8, we see the permanent interruption of Mark himself. We don't know what happened after that to Mark. Maybe he had a ticket to a boat to Alexandria. Maybe he was killed. But something happened that interrupted Mark at that point. His colleagues at Rome saw his text that he was making and realized it's not finished. Mark has left us an unfinished work. Rather than release it in that form, though, they took from another composition that Mark had made what we know as verses 9 through 20. That's why those two passages stylistically, composition-wise, don't match up exactly. That's why we have the question of why is Mary Magdalene alone now? No, why do we have the time and day restated? But it was only after that was attached to the rest of Mark, to the rest of the Gospel of Mark. Only after that point was the Gospel of Mark disseminated, was it distributed, and copies were made for church use. So by all terms of, is it original? Yes, that's part of the original text. The text that was there when the transmission stage began and the production stage was finished. But there were some folks in Egypt that didn't want anything that wasn't from the main author. Peter's authority was what they were after when they were coming to a gospel account. They wanted, oh, who cares what Mark has to say? We want what Peter has to say. That was the whole point. And so when they get copies of the Gospel of Mark, and they're aware that this part doesn't have the authority of Peter behind it, they would either set it aside or abolize it, or just say, hey, they would question it in some way. Same way we see in the Gospel of, at the end of the Gospel of John, we see one of the same scribes who made those two manuscripts that don't have Mark 16:20. Look at what one of them did to the ending of the Gospel of John. And we might need to go through a couple of slides here.
Sure. Let me see. Which one?
It has a green background, I think.
That one?
Yep.
There we go.
We'll go back to that patristic evidence, but I want you to see this. This is a slide of the end of John. Now, you won't be able to see this at the Codex Vaticanus website, but T.C. Skeet, when he did a special study on the Gospel of John in Sinaiticus, they looked at this text under ultraviolet light because Tischendorf had been sure that there was something weird here. And sure enough, just what Tischendorf had said, that was the case. Of course, Tischendorf had the advantage of having the manuscript and being able to see it under special light and so forth. But here you can see the end of John under ultraviolet light. Initially, the copyist closed out the text of John one verse early. If you look at the text in most English translations, it's got that last verse there.
Yeah.
But you also notice in the contents, we begin to talk about, instead of John talking directly, you can get the impression that it's somebody else talking about John. Where in verse 24, This is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And of course, you can get into the divisions of the book and all the higher critical text where there's the book of signs and so forth. But this last verse that comments and says, there are many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. To the copyist of Sinaiticus, that seems to have sounded like it was secondary, and so he closed out the text early. He made his little decorative mark and wrote end of the Gospel of John here, or just the Gospel of John here. So if you look through those over letters, the overwriting, you can see that Gospel of John, the closing title, was initially written here without verse 25. But then somebody said, no, you put that in there after all, and it was all redone. The initial closing title was erased. The initial closing decorative line was erased, and verse 25 was added. But there you can see in this ultraviolet picture from T.C. Skeet's work an example of where a copyist would reject something, not because it was rejected on this page, but simply because it appeared to him to be secondary. That same motivation, the motivation to preserve only the work of the main writer, also is what motivated the rejection of Mark 16:9-20. Now, if we were to do that today, our Bibles would get a whole lot shorter, because if we say, for instance, in Jeremiah, the last chapter of Jeremiah, chapter 52, it says the words of Jeremiah are ended here, but then there's another whole chapter, which are very similar to what we see in Kings or Chronicles. I think it's Kings. Also in the Psalms, if we narrowed it all down to say, well, we like the work of David, but we just want one author per book, Psalms would get a whole lot shorter. Proverbs would get a whole lot shorter. We'd have to slice off Proverbs 30 and Proverbs 31 and all the work of the men of Hezekiah. And we just want one author per book. But the idea that even though Mark 16:9-20 was not from Mark's main work, but from a different work of Mark, that didn't make a difference to the early church. In the early church, Mark 16:9-20 was widely used, and this might be a good point to go back to that patristic evidence that we had listed there.
Definitely, because that is very, very important evidence, brother. I totally agree. I believe we were at right here.
Yes. One patristic writer that is often quoted is Clement, and the reason why Clement is quoted is because he was quoted by Bruce Metzger in his textual commentary. Another case of a commentator's yeast. Metzger says, Clement of Alexandria and Origen show no knowledge of the existence of these verses. And the impression might be, when people read that, is, oh, wow, Clement didn't use Mark 16:9-20. It must not have been in his manuscripts. But really, when you look at how much of Mark Clement used, and a man named Carl Cozart recently gave an analysis of Clement's work and how much of Mark he used, and Cozart concluded that he didn't hardly use any of Mark. In fact, outside of chapter 10, in chapter 10 in Who is the Rich Man Who Shall Be Saved, he uses it quite a bit. But look at chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 15, chapter 16. We don't see Clement use all these chapters. And if anybody has any new data, I'll be happy to make the adjustment. But I think the indication that we have, and I looked through all the evidence that I could find, and Clement didn't use very much of Mark at all outside of chapter 10. So it's a very, very, very extremely much weak argument to say that we can tell from Clement not using Mark 16:9-20 that he didn't have it in his manuscript, because look at all the text of Mark that Clement did not use. In terms of how much he did use outside of chapter 10, he used 1.3% of Mark chapters 9, of Mark chapters 1-8, and in Mark chapters 11-16. So it's a very weak argument to say because Clement didn't use it. Also, Origen is often said to have not shown any knowledge of the existence of Mark 16, 19, 20. However, in his composition that was released by other fans of Origen later on, Philokalia, part 5, there is definitely in part 5 a passage which looks very much like the author is aware of Mark 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. But that's a very weak evidence is used as if it's not weak by many commentators, and people should realize this is nothing. But there are lots and lots of somethings which Metzger did not reference, and therefore other commentators, depending on Metzger, did not reference. But they merit referencing. There are many patristic writers from Roman era times. In other words, if we set aside anything from the times of Bernard de Clairvaux, anything from any time past Charlemagne, just look at the first 500 years of Christianity and look at how widely verses 19 to 20 were used. Do you have the slide that mentions of Roman era patristic writers?
Yeah, before we go there, brother, let me pick your brain on one thing. When talking about Origen of Alexandria, did Origen kind of allude to it in the Greek? Is any of the Greek parallel to it? It is, I think you're saying.
It's not a airtight case, but I would say in Philokalia part 5, there is a section where the author is stringing together several passages. He's got a passage here, a passage there, but they're thematically similar. And
okay.
I think that the thematic reference describes how the apostles used superhuman daring as they went forth to spread the word.
Incredible.
Very similar if you can compare the theme to what we see in Mark 16, 17, 18, and 19, and 20. I think there's definitely definitely might be too strong a word, but probably a connection there. That, in other words, Metzger did not really take that passage into consideration. But another reason why it's difficult to come down for that reference to perch is because it's produced by later fans of Origen who were concerned that some people in their generation were very critical of Origen's theology, and so they would kind of edit it themselves. So you can't always tell how much of that work is Origen and how much is his fans protecting Origen from being Origen.
Gotcha. So when it comes to Origen, then when it comes to that particular document, we don't have as airtight a case, I imagine, would be the honest thing to assess.
Yeah, that's the way I would put it. I would say Metzger's statement is not airtight.
There you go.
On the flip side, the opposite case is also not airtight. So it's like the coin is standing on its edge.
Wonderful. Fantastic. And you did want to go to the following slide, I believe.
Not Origen just yet, but to the Roman era patristic writers.
Yep. From let's see.
Should have a green background.
There we go.
Yeah. Looking at this list, just ask yourself: was the Gospel of Mark used without verses 9 to 20 outside of Egypt? Well, look at these writers. In the Epistula Apostolorum, by internal evidence, can be dated to before the year 150. And then a secondary form of it was before the year 180. And the reason for that is kind of humorous because it pictures Jesus saying, he's going to be back before the year 150. And then in the second form of it, it's like somebody had to redo the tract and replace the number 150 with 180. But in the Epistula Apostolorum, the writer frames his narrative in a series of events that you could easily get using Mark 16, 9 through 11, but you couldn't get it very easily without Mark 16, 9 through 11. So the Epistula Apostolorum is probably, and again, it's not airtight, but it appears to reflect the writer's awareness of the ending of Mark, all the ending. And Robert Stein is one author who has favored that connection. Also, Justin Martyr in his First Apology, chapter 45. Justin Martyr, this is a man who died by martyrdom around the year 160. In his First Apology, chapter 45, he used terms that we see to get collected together in Mark 16:20. Now, Hort, back in 1881, was kind of hesitant to grant that Justin used these three terms because he said, well, the text isn't really specific. It doesn't mention Jerusalem specifically. Well, Hort was working without the Diatessaron. Tatian, who was probably aware of Justin Martyr, we don't know how closely together they worked, but Tatian was a writer from about the year 170, or in the 170s. Tatian produced what was called the Diatessaron. It was a combination of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in the Diatessaron, you would have, for instance, the contents of Matthew, the contents of Mark, the contents of Luke, but it wouldn't be, here's Matthew, here's Mark, here's Luke, here's John. It'd be all four Gospels combined in one continuous, more or less non-repeating account. So you could save some space and save some ink, but still preserve the message of all four Gospels and the contents of all four Gospels. But Tatian's Diatessaron was from about the 170s. And in Tatian's Diatessaron, when you because Tatian was later in later generations, Tatian, well, he wasn't really a fan of eating meat. He wasn't really a fan of marriage, and so later on, as people considered Tatian more and more, his theology got worse more and more after he died. So he because he was later on considered a heretic, his books were not perpetuated. A later writer says that he took out copies from the churches. He took out hundreds of copies of the Diatessaron to replace them with the four Gospels. But in Tatian's Diatessaron, what we have is echoes of the Diatessaron in other works. So there's no single copy of the Diatessaron. Well, there is one little fragment from Der Europas, but that doesn't really tell us a whole lot. But Tatian's Diatessaron, when we look at the Arabic Diatessaron, because it survived in Arabic, in an Arabic copy that was translated from Syriac. But in that Syriac copy, its text was influenced by the Peshitta translation in Syriac. So that was an Eastern witness to the text of the Diatessaron. Meanwhile, in the West, there was a copy that was Victor of Capua. He found this copy and he said, well, that's probably a copy of Tatian's work, but he was, well, I'm an Orthodox bishop. I don't really want to be promoting the work of this person who was supposed to be a heretic, but it's so interesting. We can't just do nothing. And so what he did was he preserved the format of the Diatessaron, but the text was the Vulgate. So, well, the Vulgate, that's impeccable. And so his attempt was to preserve the format, like the arrangement of events, but the text was the text of the Vulgate. So if you can imagine, that was quite a project. But that is a manuscript that exists to this. I'm going to have to take a drink.
No problem, brother. Anytime you need to take a drink, there no problem at all. I really, so you can catch your breath a little bit. Let me say, really a ton of incredible information. I'm looking at the names you've got here, and for people that are tuning in, these are a lot of heavy hitters. These aren't and nobody. A lot of these are not unknown figures. I mean, for people that are tuning in, whether you are evangelical, you better know who some of these people are. If you're Catholic, you should, and if you're Orthodox, you should know as well. You've got such titans as Justin the Martyr, the great doctor and saint of the Catholic Church, Irenaeus, and you go and on, Hippolytus, Ephraim, who was beloved by our Syriac Orthodox brethren. So, I mean, really, when you're looking at this, from what I can tell, we have incredible testimony for the usage of the longer ending of Mark in a lot of very significant early church figures.
Yes. Ephraim, since you brought up him just now, Ephraim, about the year 360 or so, he wrote a commentary on Tatian's Diatessaron, and in his commentary, he makes references to passages from Mark 16:9-20. It's like he doesn't stop and say, well, now I'm going to recite this whole passage. But there are enough verses there to see that in his copy of the Diatessaron, there was Mark 16:9-20. Also, after Tatian, still in the second century here, Irenaeus, in his book Against Heresies, made a very interesting comment, because even though Irenaeus, even though his copies have not survived because they were probably papyrus, and outside Egypt, papyrus would not naturally rot away. That's why most of our papyrus copies come from Egypt, almost all of them. But although Irenaeus' papyrus copy of Mark did not survive, his quotation from it did. And if we could just leave this page for just a moment, we'll come back.
Definitely.
But there's a page here about Irenaeus.
Right there.
Right there. What you see here is 1582. We saw another reference to this before, but it says Irenaeus, and this is Mark 16:9-20 over here on the left. This is a little note in the margin on the right, and the note says, Irenaeus, who was near the time of the apostles, in his work Against Heresies in Book 3, cites this from Mark, this being Mark 16:19 over here in the text. There's another manuscript, GA 72, and it has the same note next to Mark 16:19 in the text. So here's the text. Here's the note that says in Greek, Book 3 of Against Heresies is only preserved in Latin, so these notes are especially significant to affirm the Greekness of the text.
Yep.
The text says, also, toward the conclusion of his gospel. And, yeah, I only see you. But anyway, Mark says...
I'll read it for you. No problem, brother. I'll read it for you. It says, also towards the conclusion of his gospel, Mark says, so then, after the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sits on the right hand of God. Just to confirm for the audience here, what I am gathering that we have from Irenaeus, who was writing before we even get to the 200s, well before the 4th century, well before any of these later manuscripts, we have an affirmation from the great Irenaeus that Christ bodily rose from the dead, because of the exact area where he's quoting from the Gospel of Mark in the longer version. And we have the ascension account as well. Is that correct, brother?
That's correct. Irenaeus doesn't give any indication that there was any textual question about this passage. And Irenaeus grew up in Asia Minor. And then later on, he became bishop in what's now France. He also visited the city of Rome in the 170s. So this is a man who was aware of the text in 3 different locales, but doesn't give any indication of the question. Later on, in Against Heresies, when he's studying Revelation, he mentions the textual variant very straightforwardly. But here, Irenaeus does not mention any variation from the text that he has.
That is very important information, because if in another location, we can expect to get that kind of pedigree from Irenaeus to where he is admitting of a textual variant. Why not find that as well in this particular area? And you're telling us that he doesn't list it. So what Irenaeus, who for people to realize, as we know very well, was taught and trained by Polycarp. Polycarp comes from the lineage of John. The incredible pedigree that we have there would indicate to us that the great Irenaeus was well acquainted with the longer ending of Mark, which contained the bodily resurrection account and the ascension account. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I wish that Mark Strauss and the folks making the footnotes for the NIV would mention, instead of mentioning the manuscripts from the 300s, mention Irenaeus' manuscript from the 200s when it comes to making a footnote for Mark 16:9-20. We often see those 2 manuscripts mentioned. It's hardly ever mentioned that there's just 2. But Irenaeus, we see this evidence from what his manuscript said, and it goes silent. Irenaeus is gagged. He might as well have a blanket over his face. Why don't the footnotes mention Irenaeus? But getting back to the other patristic writers, if we can go back to them.
Definitely. It would almost seem as if as if they have an agenda.
Yeah, almost. I can't read their minds. But Hippolytus, when he makes a reference to when people, if they come to the Lord's table and they come in faith, he mentions that even if something after this experience were given to them, it would not hurt them. And in the Greek text, we don't have a whole lot of his Greek text, but we do have a little bit. The term that he uses is thanasimon, which is what we see in Mark 16:18. Also, the Dascula Apostolorum, also Vincentius, who is an African bishop attending the Seventh Council of Carthage. Vincentius refers to makes a informal quotation from Mark 16. In the Acts of Pilate, which was a work which had more than one form, but in both forms, parts of Mark 16 are used. Parts of Mark 16 and 20 are used. And then we have Marinus, who was an associate of Eusebius of Caesarea. Now it's time to zoom in on Eusebius. Marinus wrote a letter to Eusebius saying, Eusebius, Marinus was just a mine of questions, but one of his questions was, how do you reconcile the question of the timing of the resurrection of Christ? Is it like what Matthew says in Matthew 28? Or is it early in the morning on the first day of the week, like it says in Mark 16? So Marinus' text, you can tell by just reading the question, had Mark 16:9-20. We see verse 9 being referred to. Eusebius gave an answer which has probably been one of the most misrepresented patristic quotations in history. Because Eusebius gave an answer that said, well, Marinus, there's two ways to go about answering this question. One way you could answer it was to say, well, that last part, Mark 16:9-20, isn't in all manuscripts. In fact, it's seldom found, though it's not in the most accurate manuscripts. He kind of reframes it in different ways. But then he says, so that's one thing you could do. One way to settle the question would be to just dismiss the question because this last part isn't in all copies. In fact, it seldom is present. But that's not all Eusebius says, even though when you read some commentaries that just give snippets, that's all that you get presented with. But there was more that Eusebius said, and then if you can get a hold of Roger Pierce's Eusebius of Caesarea, Gospel Problems and Solutions, and it's easy to get a hold of because it's free online.
Yeah, you're right about that. It's quite easy to get a hold of. That is, and you brought up that point earlier that we were going to return to this important figure in church history, and now we've gotten there and we recognize how important that kind of information is from a titan of early church history.
So she says you could a person might that's what a person could say, but another person could take a different route and say we shouldn't pick and choose between Matthew and Mark, and here then is how you should pronounce the reading in Mark. Simply use a pause after that first phrase to say rising early, comma, on the first day of the week, and then proceed with that. So what's being described isn't the rising, but rather is the appearance to Mary Magdalene, and that resolves the question. Also, in the same composition, ad Marinum, which you can read in this book, Eusebius, out of the blue, makes another reference to Mark 16:9 by himself when he's not being asked about it. He says, in some copies of Mark, it says that Mary Magdalene had 7 demons cast out of her, and he makes the same reference a little farther along without even clarifying that qualification about in some manuscripts. He just says, and according to Mark, Jesus cast out 7 demons out of Mary Magdalene. So that's not the way to reject a passage. Some folks might say, Eusebius of Caesarea's name is down here in the apparatus. That means he is against the passage, right? When he wrote to Marinus, he said, this is how you pronounce verse 9. This is how you solve or resolve that appearance of contradiction. This is how it's easily resolved. And that's not what a person says when he's saying, reject the passage, throw it out. So Eusebius of Caesarea, at the time he wrote to Marinus, embraces Mark 16:9 and explains to Marinus how to read it in the church service. Now, it's entirely possible that Eusebius of Caesarea may have changed his mind at some point, but the evidence from Ad Marinum is that he accepted it, and he used Mark 69 on 2 different occasions in the same composition. Now, that is hardly ever pointed out. All we see is claims that say, Eusebius of Caesarea said that it's hardly ever found in some manuscripts. That's not what he said. Eusebius said that's what some people could say. That might have been what somebody was actually saying. But when you look at what Eusebius said, he leaves it to be accepted by Marinus. There's also the creator of the Freer Logion, the passage that we saw between verses 14 and 15 in Codex W. And Metzger, again, Bruce Metzger thought this might be the work of a 2nd or 3rd century writer who's trying to relieve the what could look embarrassing to the apostles. He's trying to relieve them of some guilt, or make them appear better than they really were. But to the Freer Logion creator, if this is from the 2nd century or the 3rd century, this is yet another author who's using Mark 69-20, who is earlier than Codex Vaticanus and earlier than Codex Sinaiticus. Then there's Fortunatianus, and Fortunatianus is not well known. His commentary is the earliest Latin commentary on the Gospel of Mark, and it's just recently been released. Lucas Fortnauer, I think, along with Hugh Calton, worked on this. But Fortunatianus, he doesn't explicitly say, "Oh yeah, here's the quote from Mark," but he does say Mark deserves the symbol of the eagle. Now, usually the eagle is represented by John. But the Fortunatianus, he says, Mark deserves the symbol of the eagle because he tells us about Jesus' ascension. So
Wow.
there's Fortunatianus. And when we see, where does Mark tell us about the ascension? In Mark 16:19.
Yeah, that would only happen in the bodily resurrection account and the ascension. So that is very significant.
Yeah. And Fortunatianus is writing probably at the same time as Sinaiticus is being made. Ambrose of Milan is in Italy. That's where Milan is. Milan was a very important city. Ambrose was a very important writer, and he's using Mark 16:19-20 abundantly. Palladius of Rheteria was somewhere else. He was on the other side. He was pretty much an Arian, but he also has a reference to the contents of Mark 16:19-20. And the Claromontanus catalog, which is just a kind of, it's just one copy of it's in Codex Claromontanus, but it lists how many sense lines the books have. In other words, when they're written sense by sense, kind of like poetry, it would have this many lines, and the length is consistent with the inclusion of Mark 16:19-20. Ephraim Cyrus, we already referred to in his commentary on the Diatessaron. He makes references to the contents of Mark 16:19-20. And Apostolic Constitutions, this is a writing from about the year 380. It's connected somewhat to the Didascalia Apostolorum. Very clearly uses Mark 16:19-20. Didymus is called into question as a writer because in his book De Trinitate on the Trinity, we're not really sure if it's Didymus or if it's somebody else, because there were some things that he says in De Trinitate, which looks like either he's had a big change of mind on some issues, or it's simply a different person. But if it's not Didymus, the blind of Egypt, then it's somebody that looks like he's come from that same region, using Mark 16:19-20.
Still would have been an early church writer. We can conclude, correct?
Yes. Also, Epiphanius, who was a rather famous heresy hunter. He did what Irenaeus did, but on steroids, you could say. Anything he saw that looked like a heresy. But Epiphanius also made reference to the contents of Mark 16:19-20. And again, although I'm saying made reference to the content, that's kind of vague. But in my book, I give a specific documentation of when and where. St. Augustine, you might have heard of this guy. St. Augustine, around the year 400, makes references extensively to Mark 16:19-20, makes comment after comment. Also, at one point, he refers to his Greek manuscript. So he's not just writing in Latin, but this is Augustine making reference to his Greek copies And there's a reading that they have that he emphasizes at one point in his Greek manuscripts. There's also a group of very pseudographical and very fantastic, but fantastic not in the good way. But in the Lucian Acts, there's references to the contents of Mark 16:19-20. Also, Jerome. Jerome is sometimes considered he's sometimes paired up with Eusebius, as if some commentaries would say Eusebius and Jerome, they both said that hardly any copies had this passage. But again, his other comments are ignored. But in the case of Jerome, there's three things to appreciate. First, in 383, when Jerome made the Vulgate Gospels, he says explicitly in his preface to the Gospels, I used ancient Greek manuscripts as the basis for this work. Well, Jerome was fairly old by that point, and he probably, to call a manuscript ancient, it probably would have had to have been at least as old as Jerome himself was. Yeah. So we'd be picturing manuscripts older than Sinaiticus at this point. Also, when he's writing the part that people say he's saying this thing about hardly any manuscripts have the passage, people need to take a closer look at that composition. That is his letter 120 to Hedibia. And what that part of his letter to Hedibia is, he's taking Eusebius's almost 100 years old Greek work and reframing it in Latin. Hedibia has asked a very broad question. It's like, how do you resolve the difficulties about the resurrection accounts? Well, that's a pretty broad question. You could write a whole book on just that question. But to make things easier for Jerome, just as he said he did in his Epistle 75, he said, sometimes I just repeat what people have said before me, and I leave it to the reader to pick and choose. Well, as he's recycling what Eusebius said, he does include the passage that says, well, what should we do to resolve this question about Mark 16:19? Well, one thing we could do is just reject Mark's account, because it occurs so suddenly in hardly any of the Greek manuscripts. Or we could embrace it. And then he proceeds to say just what Eusebius said, which was how to pronounce the passage, how to pronounce Mark 16:9, so that there's no appearance of difficulty. So in the Vulgate, he's using Mark 16:19-20 from an ancient Greek manuscript. He includes it in the Vulgate. When he's talking to Hedibia, he recycles Eusebius. That's all he's doing. As D.C. Parker acknowledged in the book, The Living Text of the Gospels, D.C. Parker could see crystal clearly. I don't know why to some people it doesn't seem crystal clear, but it should be crystal clear. That is what he is doing. He's not pursuing that path because he knows that's not the path that he's going to recommend taking. And that's all there is to Jerome's statement. But there is one more thing that he says later on in his writing to the against the Pelagians. And we already covered it in part, where he says, I found this reading in copies of Mark, and then he presents what we know as the Philologion, the thing we saw in the Codex W. And he says, I found this in some copies, especially in Greek codices. So when he's writing to answer the Pelagians, he mentions the Philologion, and he doesn't say it's in there somewhere. He specifies specifically and quotes Mark 16:14, and the impression is not, you have heard of Mark 16:14, right? He expects his readers to know exactly where Mark 16:14 is. Then there's Chromatius, who was a famous, sometimes friend, sometimes foe of Jerome, also uses it. Macarius Magnes, around the year 410, an often overlooked writer. Macarius Magnes, and by the way, this is where Hierocles up here comes in. Macarius Magnes wrote a book that was answering the jibes and criticisms of a pagan writer. And Macarius Magnes, when Mark 16:9-20 is brought up, he answers that not by saying, oh, well, we can dismiss that. That's not in any manuscript. He takes a totally different tack. But the writer that he's answering is probably Hierocles. Who was Hierocles? Hierocles was a student of Porphyry, who was not a Christian, very much against Christianity, but Hierocles was also in the government in Asia Minor. And as Macarius Magnes is answering him, Hierocles was known for doing the same kind of thing that Jerome did with earlier writers, except Hierocles was known for, we would call it plagiarism, but he was basically just borrowing the work of his mentor, Porphyry, and putting them down in different form. So what the book that Macarius Magnes is answering is probably a book by Hierocles. But Hierocles had an interesting jibe when he says when he's writing against the Christians, he says, I'm going to paraphrase. Hierocles says, those Christians who are fighting to gain their offices in the church, well, there's an easy solution. Look in your Gospels where it says about handling snakes, and where it talks about drinking poison. Well, what you should do is you should set out some poison for each other, and the one who drinks the most poison, he should become the bishop. And the one who neglects to become bishop, the one who declines the poison, well, he shouldn't get the office. And now that's not quite what it says, but again, in my book, I give it more accurately. But so that's Hierocles. Now, interestingly, the date of Hierocles is around 305, which is earlier than both Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. So that's the book that's being answered against by Macarius Magnes around the year 410.
Let me just emphasize one really good point that you just brought up there, brother. And it does give you a little bit of time to get a drink there. You've been incredible, by the way, this evening. But you brought up a really good point there. And this testimony that you just went over, is it correct that would predate Vaticanus and Sinaiticus? Is that correct?
Yes. This would be about the year 305. Vaticanus. Most people would say Vaticanus was around 325, but you can't really rule out a certain wiggle room of 50 years either way,
right?
Because the date is assigned on the basis of paleography. But generally, 305 is earlier than the midway date that most people would assign to Vaticanus.
It's a really good point, because either which way, for the audience to know, either which way you've presented and you're presenting them a bevy of information that even if we, with what you just brought up right now on this particular point, even if we give 50 years either which way, the fact that we have early witnesses like Irenaeus, that in and of itself, manuscript of Irenaeus blows that out of the water, doesn't it?
In terms of chronological order, it does. But also John Chrysostom makes some references that look very much like he's referring to Mark 16:9 and other passages. In Doctrine of Bodily, which probably comes from about the year 400, and Doctrine of Bodily is a composite work, so it's hard to tell at any given point of it what date to assign to that part of the work, because it's a composite. But Doctrine of Bodily uses the contents of Mark 16:9-20. The heretic Pelagius uses Mark 16:9-20, our passage from Mark 16:9-20. The author Philostorgius gives a vivid narrative where Mark 16:9-20 is used as a reference to what a person should do with a snake that just happens to be along the way. Esnik of Golb is a seldom mentioned reference. We often see in Metzger's commentary a reference to in the Armenian version, there's many copies. Well, those are pretty late copies. That's well after Charlemagne. But Esnik of Golb is in the 400s. And in his work, The Deo, he uses Mark 16:17-18. Also, Prosper of Aquitaine, yet another locale. Now again, if these were all witnesses from one region, from Egypt, that would be one thing. But these guys are from all over the place. Prosper of Aquitaine also has no reservation about using Mark 16:20. Over in Egypt, St. Patrick uses Mark 16:16. Marius Mercator, not very well known, but his sermon is there. Marcus Aramea is in the land of Israel, and he's using Mark 16:9-20. According to a quotation by Cyril of Alexandria, quoting Nestorius used a passage from there in Mark 16:9-20. Leo the Great, of course, by this time, the Vulgate is in the upswing. So after Leo, most Latin writers are going to be using the Vulgate, so it's just an echo. But Leo the Great is also using Mark 16:9-20. And Peter Chrysologus, who's writing, I think, somewhere around Ravenna, I think. But again, see my book for more details. He also uses and preaches from Mark 16:9-20. A little bit later are these writers down here, which Victor of Antioch, a Palestinian exemplar that Victor refers to as being of especially esteemed, Severus in his homily 77, Leontius of Jerusalem, other Latin writers. Also down here, we're getting into the 600s, but in a little-known composition called the Enthronement of the Archangel Michael, which is not later than the 600s. Also in the life of Saint Samson of Dole, it's kind of a humorous anecdote that says that people were trying to kill Saint Samson of Dole. This is one of the missionary saints of Britain. Saint Samson, people were trying to kill him. He knew they were going to try to poison him, but then when he saw the cup before him and knew that he was being tested by the enemy, the account says that he said a prayer for protection, drank down the chalice, and didn't feel any effects, not even a headache. There's also the revelation of the Magi, extant in, I think, just one manuscript that has been recently analyzed or translated, and it contains a very clear reference to the contents of Mark 16:9-20, and would just barely into the 600s at this point. But you can see from the time when there was a Roman emperor on the throne and on into the time after that, and the pile just gets bigger and bigger. We have all this evidence that shows it's not just one branch of the tree, but we see Mark 16:9-20 being used all over the church, especially in the place where the Gospel of Mark was written to, the church in Rome. Mark, the shorter ending, was never in Rome, as far as we can tell, until maybe much later on, centuries and centuries later, somebody took a copy of that somewhere else, like a manuscript to 024 has it in the lower margin, but in the text, Mark 16:9 follows Mark 16:8 immediately, and you can even see in the margin of that manuscript a reference to how Mark 16:9-20 was used in the church's lectionary. So there you can see. I've just to save time, I've avoided lots of the details about these, but you can go to my book and see more of the details and why each one is assigned to the time that it's assigned to. I skipped the Old Latin Capitulum, I think, but that's a form of how the chapters of Mark were arranged, because our 16 chapters, that standardization came along much later. In the early Old Latin copies, they would assign they would break up the chapters differently. But in the Old Latin chapter descriptions, because they would summarize the chapters, in some Old Latin copies that have this feature of having these summaries or these breves, we see in all those forms of the chapter summaries, we have references to Mark 16:9-20, including the CY form, which is estimated to go back to the time of Cyprian, which would be the 200s, or very slightly after that. So there's another reference before Vaticanus, before Sinaiticus. None of these are mentioned in your Bible footnotes. It'd be nice to have just one or two, but we have none. And of course, that does not give the typical reader an accurate picture of the evidence at all.
No, it really doesn't, brother. What a fantastic presentation you've put forward. You made another point that I want to emphasize for the audience to really soak it in and to kind of grasp what it is you're pointing out. A very good point that Mark would have been penned in Rome. And you bring up a really good point that when we look at those authors from that location, we look at the fact that the evidence is pretty much incredible in showing that in the very location where it would have originated from, where it would have been penned, we look and we notice, examining the evidence, we have the longer ending in Rome. So, very strong evidence to me. So rather than a ton of evidence of the shorter ending being present where it would have been penned, we've got evidence of the longer ending being present there. Is that correct?
Yes, the shorter ending is definitely an Egyptian phenomenon. Its Greek sources are, you can tell not only by the links that I showed between Codex L and Greek Sahidic Lectionary 1602, but also when you look at the notes that are present in those manuscripts, it's the same notes being perpetuated. So this is not like a random reading or random treatment that came up in this locale and that locale. It all echoes an approach that was in Egypt. And the shorter ending really has no business being in the New Testament. It's not regarded as authentic by anybody, as far as I know. But another thing to point out is that Metzger, and because Metzger said it, many other later commentaries say it, Metzger made a claim about vocabulary, the vocabulary in Mark 16:9-20. And I'd like to make a short point about that. Do you have the green background slide of once used words?
Sure do, brother. It would be. Well, there we go.
That's the one. Kareem Hanifi made an analysis of this, because sometimes we ask ourselves, well, the claim from Metzger is that the longer ending, though current in a variety of witnesses, and we've seen what variety is, means all but three, some of them ancient, must also be judged by internal evidence to be secondary. And the first point that he makes is the vocabulary and style of verses 9-20 are non-marking, and he lists words that are found nowhere else in Mark. Now, he also says anthanasimon and tois met auto genomenos as designations of disciples occur only here in the New Testament. So the idea is that there are a lot of words in Mark 16:9-20 that don't appear anywhere else in Mark. Therefore, he then proceeds to call them non-Markan words, just because they've been used once and they don't appear anywhere else in Mark. Well, if having a certain number of words appear in a 12-verse section makes them non-Markan, let's look all the way through the Gospel of Mark and see how many 12-verse sections contain how many once-used words. In other words, how many once-used words do we need to have to say this passage is non-Markan? As he lists, I think, 18. Some of the commentators have seen the number 16. Well, let's go with it. Let's go with 18. In Mark 1:1-12, there's 17. That's one less once-used words. Chapter 2, 16-27, 18. It's a tie. Again, you can see. You can just you can read the presentation right there. In 4:13-24, 16 once-used words. Next, 4:37-5:7, 17 once-used words. In chapter 7, verses 17-28, there's 21 once-used words. 21 is more than 18. Moving right along to chapter 12, 34-13:1, 19. Is that passage not from Mark? Because it's using so many once-used words. Chapter 13, verses 14-13:25, 21. Again, more once-used words. Is this passage non-Markan? And this is the point that Metzger is starting with. This is number one point about the vocabulary. 12:34-13:1, 19. 13:14-13:25, 21. 14:1-14:12, 20. 14:37-14:48, 19. 15:13-24, 23, and in 15:37-16:1, 24. Are these 12-verse passages also non-Markan because they have a certain number of once-used words? This is Metzger's number one point that he's trying to make. And I don't know why he says that thanasimon is a designation of the disciples. That's simply the word that he uses to describe a deadly thing. I can't explain that comment from Metzger. It makes no sense. But this is what commentators refer to over and over again. But they don't also refer to these other places that have even more once-used words than 16:9-20 have, or which have a very similar, comparable number of once-used words. So the internal evidence is not nearly as strong, and it's not fairly presented by so many commentators, because they're all just parroting what they read in Metzger's textual commentary. Now, obviously, not all. There's a few that don't, but very, very many do.
The massive majority would definitely lean the other way, though.
Well, you can only divide Mark into so many 12-verse passages. But
Right.
the thing is that there shouldn't be any more. If you're going to use that aspect of the passage to say, well, that implies non-markedness, it would also imply non-markedness for all these other passages.
It's a very good point.
Mark uses a lot of once used words.
Yeah, so which would render that whole argument quite fallacious.
Well, it would be superfluous.
Superfluous, correct. Yeah.
So also finally, I have more information because my research hasn't stood still. I'm hoping to make a 2021 edition, but you can find the editions that I have now. I think there's a final slide where you can find my book.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Right there. There we go.
Go back to the lectures. I have an online series of lectures on textual criticism of the New Testament. The 16th lecture is right there, and the 17th lecture also is on Mark 16, covering more of covering the shorter ending and the external evidence. So if everybody's invited to go watch lecture 16 and 17, and if you dial up the speed a little bit, I might start moving your mouse a bit, but you can still get the gist of it.
What I will do, brother, after we're done here, look in the bottom for whoever is rewatching, or if you're watching and you want to get that link, I will include those links in the bottom. Just look down there; they'll be there for you to click, as well as the link to where people can find your incredible work on this topic. And I want to let people know that you're letting them know kindly that they can find it available on academia.edu. But the kind of information you've put out here is a gold mine. It's very affordable to find on Amazon. If you all are able to support the brother in any way, consider doing it, because it's an incredible piece of work that he's put together, and really it is a one-of-a-kind edition. And if I understand properly, brother, you hope to get another book, or what are you trying to get in 2021 before we're done with the year?
Yes, I hope to revise this book, expand it a bit with some new additional references, correct a few typos. I think the manuscript 2866, that ought to be 2886. So when you read references to 2866, it's really 2886. Make that correction, and a few other little tweaks and improvements by the end of the year. That's my hope.
Incredible, brother. And I'm really thrilled that we've had a very enthusiastic audience tuning in. At one point, we had about 390. Right now, we have close to 300 watching live. They're really enjoying and loving your performance. With that being said, we have a gentleman that is really curious in the audience, would like to know, has James White engaged any of these arguments that you've put forth?
Currently, James White, not too recently, engaged another person, Jeff Riddle, in a debate, which was a two-part debate. The first part was about the ending of Mark. The second part was about Ephesians 3:9, a reading in Ephesians 3:9. And I think that anybody that goes to that site and goes through the time it takes to watch that debate will see that although James White pretty much knocked the ecclesiastical bibliology view out of the ring, as far as the first part of the debate, James White was knocked out repeatedly, and that was with Jeff Riddle pulling his punches. But no, James White, I have invited James White repeatedly, and the offer still stands. Pick the venue, and I will be happy to debate James White on the issue. Currently, James White is objecting his objections to Mark 16:19-20. Even though at one point he says that we shouldn't have theological objections as a basis for rejecting a passage, but when you actually watch him talk about Mark 16:19-20, he says almost verbatim, and I think I have quoted him verbatim in another video, but he will say, well, when I see them talk about Jesus appearing in another form, oh, well, that's theologically questionable, as if the church for thousands of for the whole term of its existence, having Mark 16:19-20, that everybody that's used the Vulgate everybody that's used the Peshitta, because the Peshitta and the Vulgate both have Mark 16 and 20. To say that this is theologically objectionable is just a desperation, in my humble opinion. But no, James White has not yet answered positively to my invitation, but the offer still stands. Perhaps one day he will change his mind. I would say that when James White says in his books and in his videos that Mark has 5 different endings, that gives a false impression, I think, because when people think endings, they think besides the ending in Mark 16:8, as if there were just endings popping up here and there and there and there and there, five different places. But he's not the only one that's guilty of doing that. I think Michael Holmes, in his biblical archaeology review essay, said there were 7, I think. But really, it depends on how you juggle them. You can't say that when they're in when a manuscript has this and that makes a different ending, or when a manuscript has this and a note and that makes a different ending. In the real world, there are 2 different endings after verse 8. There is the shorter ending, which circulated in Egypt, and there's Mark 16:9-20 that originated and that was circulating pretty much everywhere else.
Yeah, and you kind of got to feel a little bit of compassion for James. He's an expert when it comes to Islam. He's an expert when it comes to Catholicism. He's an expert when it comes to anything dealing with theology. But then again, coming back to the real world, getting back to the real world, without playing around, we would hope that one day James White does engage the arguments that you're putting forth, because you're not only putting forth compelling argumentation, you're putting forth fantastic arguments that are airtight and need a kind of reply from the other side that are trying to hammer down against the arguments you're putting forth. And as you point out, name the venue, name the location. We will hope to get this message out to him as well. I will personally send it to James. James, you gotta finally reply to the brother James snap. We want it. It can be a neutral venue. I mean, a neutral venue, or doing it online. We'll find a neutral moderator. Doesn't have to be me. I know James would probably never do a debate with me as a moderator, but it could be a neutral moderator. But your hope is to get it done. You want to have an honest and a fair dialogue.
Yeah, and James White is a paragon of accuracy compared to the wild claims that John MacArthur makes about this passage. So anytime anybody from Grace to You, or anytime Dan Wallace would like to engage in a formal debate about this passage, I'd be welcome to engage in that.
And brother,
with James White, it's like when you see the shorter ending and the longer ending, and then say that, oh, but with the Philologion, that's another ending. Really, that's just an interpolation. Mark 16:9-20 is still there. But in James White's world, if you have $2 and you're trying to buy a $3 hamburger, you go to the store and you say, how much is a hamburger? And they say $3. And you say, well, I have 2, but they're side by side, so now I have 3. So can I buy a hamburger?
You always without a doubt have a platform here, brother. Before we wrap up, maybe if you don't mind, maybe a few minutes, if anybody has anything on their mind that they'd like to pick your brain with. The brother James Snap has been here for over 2 hours. He's done a fantastic job. We don't want to keep him much longer, but if anybody has anything on your mind, if you want to pick his brain, I am looking in the chat here in the Zoom, and I am looking in the YouTube. We have somebody that is requesting that you do come back and you do talk about John 7:53, 8-11, and later on in the future we'll do that. Dennis, we will definitely do that. But if anybody does have any questions relevant to the topic at hand, in Zoom, feel free to unmute your mic. You can ask him. On YouTube, I am looking to see if there are any questions. I know earlier there was one. And you know what? I will, as you all try and think of a question, I will ask that question. A gentleman by the name of Charles brought it up earlier, and I can't find it right now, but I'm going to summarize it. He wanted to confirm when you brought up Peter earlier, Peter and the longer ending. He just wanted to confirm you were not saying that Peter did not approve of the longer ending, were you?
No, but by the time that the Gospel of Mark was written, I think the situation at Rome was so chaotic that you can't really nail down whether or not Peter was aware of what Mark was doing. Even in the early accounts from Clement and Papyrus, it's not entirely consistent. But the idea is that what Mark was doing, Peter didn't say yes or no, because he's still alive. He's still able to make clarifications when somebody asks a question. That's one advantage of speaking spontaneously that you don't get in any written book. Papyrus spoke to the disadvantages of making a book, and one of the disadvantages is that you can't do with a book what you can do with the living word. So there's no evidence that Peter, no. As far as evidence, no. We just have the book as it is.
Very good answer. I am looking. Hannah, by the way, who is a fantastic moderator of ours, she's wondering. She says, my study Bible says there are numerous Latin, Syriac, Armenian, and Georgian manuscripts that lack the ending. You said there were 6 with a shorter ending. Is this correct? Are these later manuscripts?
Can you list all those again?
She said, my study Bible says there are numerous Latin, Syriac, Armenian, and Georgian that lack the ending.
There is one Latin, that's a Codex Vaticanus, the one that has the shorter ending. And also it has an extra material between verses 3 and 4, which would pose problems trying to be harmonized with the contents of Mark 16 to 20. So that one has a unique feature in Mark 16, 3 through 4 that also could stand to be looked at more closely. But that's the one Latin manuscript. Now I think that there's one copy in Latin of the Vulgate text that ends at Mark 16:8, but it shows clear signs of simply being damaged. That the lection ended there, and there was more, but it's simply not extant anymore. But that's a copy of the Vulgate that's just shows us the text up to verse 8. But that's a glitch reading, you could say. Now, as far as Syriac, there is one Syriac manuscript. That was the Sinaitic Syriac that I mentioned. That was found at St. Catherine's by the sister researchers, Lewis and the other one. And that is the Sinaitic Syriac, probably made with a different text base than Sinaiticus or Vaticanus, but generally representing the same locale. Then there's one. What was the other kind?
It was Armenian and Georgian.
Armenian and Georgian. As I mentioned before, Metzger mentions Armenian and Georgian, but doesn't mention Esnik of Gold. And when you consider the Armenian and the Georgian, understand that the Georgian was translated back in the 400s or so from Armenian. So when you hear a writer, you can't really hear a writer, but when you read that Armenian and Georgian, it's like hearing about the voice and the echo of the voice. It doesn't really multiply things in terms of variety. But the Georgian descended from the Armenian. And to really get into that, we need to get into the origin of the Armenian version, because Mesrop Mestotes, Mesrop, he is responsible for the first stage of the Armenian version. But almost immediately after he made that initial step, the text was revised because some of his assistants had wandered down to the Council of Ephesus, and while they were at the Council of Ephesus, or while they were visiting other places, while they were on the way to or from Ephesus, they found a codex, what they considered a very valuable codex, and so they brought it back to Armenia and revised the text on the basis of what they found. So when you look at the Armenian version, you're looking at a very stratified text. Some Armenian copies will echo that first stage, others will reflect a later stage, yet others will reflect a later stage when the text was being conformed even to the Vulgate influence, so the Cilician Armenian. So there are stages to consider. It's not a simple question at all. But yes, there are Armenian copies that end in Armenian at verse 8. There are lots of other Armenian copies that end at verse 20. But there's also the comment by Esnik of Golb in the 400s using marks 16, 17, and 18. So that would indicate the kind of text that he had there in the hundreds. But the Armenian version is complicated, and so is its relationship to the later Georgian translation. But yes, there are Armenian copies that end at mark 16, 8, and about 100. There is probably online, you can probably find the research work from 1937 that was made, where a scholar looked into the oldest manuscripts he could find and access, and he found about 100 early copies, but there were also oodles and oodles more that included mark 16, 20, and also they could look at the references, the patristic writings that would make reference to the contents of mark 16, 20. So that is a part of the evidence that hopefully I will get a chance to delve into more closely in the next edition of the book. But I do cover the Armenian evidence quite extensively to an extent in my book. There's lots of Armenian copies that have never seen the light of day in some of the manuscripts that have come forward with their collections in more recent times. So a lot of the Armenian and Georgian evidence is still in a pile of unorganized manuscripts, but they're working on it. It's getting closer and closer every day.
Great reply, brother. Fantastic. One final one, and then we can wrap it up. James, it's been incredible. It comes from a brother by the name of Drench. Drench wants to know, how do you reply to people who do not accept early church fathers for textual criticism because they are later extant manuscripts?
Well, there are patristic writers like Irenaeus that are earlier than extant manuscripts.
Yeah, I think the person posing the question doesn't recognize that people do utilize church fathers in criticism. So they're not ignoring all of the witnesses. They're just being convenient with which ones they want to utilize. So I think maybe he didn't quite understand that. So your point is a fantastic one, is that we do have that earlier manuscript evidence, with particularly a very strong one in Irenaeus. Isn't that correct?
Yes, unfortunately, even though Hort's theory about the Lucianic recension is falling and falling, it's like the more you look at it, the more holes there are to fill in. But nevertheless, scholars still are holding on to that theory, that model of transmission, and as a result, they, as Alan said, they are for the most part, just considering Byzantine manuscripts to be irrelevant for textual criticism. And so there go all of the Byzantine manuscripts by the dozens. And because Irenaeus is not considered a user of the Alexandrian text, they also ignore Irenaeus. In fact, anything that does not support Vaticanus and Sinaiticus when they agree is considered inferior simply because that premise has become entrenched. But I don't think it really deserves to be entrenched. And I think the evidence in this particular case points away from those conclusions that they've drawn.
Brother, you have been incredible, and greatly appreciate the time you've given us, and we will definitely bring you back. And whenever your other book does come out, you've got a platform here to come and to promote that. And anytime you're definitely welcome here. Brother, thank you so much for your time. Everybody, check out the Brother James, his book, his website, his blog, his YouTube. All of those links will be there in the bottom. Brother, you're welcome here anytime. God bless you, and I look forward to talking to you again.
All right. Thank you very much.